Police officers are widely regarded as amongst the most highly credible of eyewitnesses. But if they encounter anything unusual that could be considered paranormal, they risk professional ridicule if they dare to reveal their otherworldly encounters with things that should not exist, but do. The following are two stories about police and paranormal encounters, where in some cases they have come across cases that go way beyond what would be a normal day on the job. Virginia. Roanoke is a city in the Blue Ridge Mountains of southwest Virginia, where the city has many historic buildings. It is a medium-sized town with the usual type of crime problems, typical of its size compared with other towns across America. At the time of the unusual incident, the following police officer had been serving on the Roanoke Police Department for 27 years and had retired in 2002 as a detective sergeant. In the mid-1980s, his partner was an officer called David Ragland, and they worked on burglary detail, where they patrolled in uniform in an unmarked van. It was very early in the morning, shortly before sunrise, when they spotted a vehicle moving slowly through a neighbourhood. Suspicious, they decided to follow the vehicle, believing it was possibly casing the houses. However, the driver must have sensed that they were onto him and drove off at a fast speed. They quickly called for a uniformed car to pull him over. Even though he was reaching speeds of about 70 miles per hour, they continued to follow him and keep him in their sights as they followed in their unmarked car. It soon became apparent that he was probably heading to the next town, which was St. Louis, which was about 685 miles away, or towards Schaffers Crossing, which had a 100-foot-long concrete railroad tunnel. They were concerned about pursuing the man at such high speeds, as a desperate man will do desperate things and push his vehicle to dangerous speeds, endangering other traffic. But all of a sudden, the pursuit came to an abrupt end when the driver appeared to lose control of the steering and in a moment of panic had slammed the vehicle straight into the concrete archway. Both he and his partner were approximately 200 feet behind the speeding car when he crashed into the archway. They could only look in horror as the now destroyed vehicle had been lifted about 2 feet into the air. But what happened next was to shock the two police officers further when the large white male, about 5 foot 10 inches tall, managed to squeeze himself out of the small driver's window, seemingly unscathed, and raced off into the tunnel. How on earth did he survive the impact? Wasting no time, the two police officers took chase. The man was running extremely fast, but they managed to keep him in their sights. They felt they were closing the gap and drew close enough to see him clearly, but all of a sudden, the man vanished into thin air. They stopped and looked around and could see there were no other exits and checked every inch of the tunnel, but to no avail. There was simply no trace of the man. The two officers were totally confused and bewildered as they reluctantly headed back down the tunnel. As they neared the crash site, they could see their van and the driver's car that was now a total wreck. And as they got closer, they found the body of the driver still inside the damaged vehicle. The body in the car was the exact same man, as his clothing was the same, as well as his weight and height. So, who is the person that jumped out of the car and then chased down the tunnel, but was now deceased in the driver's seat, crushed by the steering wheel and dashboard? Now in shock, they called the supervisor and traffic unit to attend the scene of the accident and then told them what had occurred. How they had spotted the suspicious vehicle and decided to pursue it. How they witnessed the crash, ran after the driver but lost him when he vanished in front of their eyes. Then found him a few minutes later, deceased behind the wheel of his car, crushed by the steering wheel. Their supervisor was an older officer who had been in the force for many years and knew how the department would react if they described everything in detail. They were advised to write everything down but to leave out all references to chasing the dead man on foot through the tunnel. The police officer and his partner are now both retired and remain close friends. His partner David Ragland is a religious man, however they still occasionally talked about that evening and neither has an opinion on what they saw. The retired officers even discussed the incident with his minister, but he could offer no explanation as to what happened. But they both say that there is no doubt in their mind that they saw and chased the spirit of the deceased driver, fleeing from them before disappearing into thin air. Michigan. January in southeast Michigan is freezing, and a police officer was on patrol in an area where people would normally flock to in summer, but in the winter months there was nothing to see but a blanket of snow. On one particular night in January, the officer was driving through a snowstorm on a road that leads to Lake Erie and spotted a man in a suit and a fedora hat. The hat looked to be the type worn by someone from the 1940s, and wrapped around him was a grey blanket. The man looked to be in a hurry or on a mission. It was snowing hard and the temperature would have been around 20 degrees, so it was the type of conditions that nobody should have been out in. The police officer figured that for anyone to be out in this inclement weather in the middle of nowhere and dressed only in a suit and blanket must be mentally ill. The officer notified dispatch that he was going to make contact with the lone walker and drove slowly up next to him. As he drew closer, he was now close enough to see more detail of what he was wearing. He quickly looked down to switch on the alley lights, and when he looked back up, the guy had vanished, and when he looked around for him, he was nowhere to be seen. Not suspicious at this stage, the officer figured he must have fallen down somewhere and got out of the car to look around for him. After walking around the car and the surrounding area, he found no sign of him. As it had been constantly snowing, he looked around for footprints, but there was none to be found. The last thing on the officer's mind would have been that the missing man suddenly vanishing would be anything out of the ordinary, and given the terrible weather, it was now a possible rescue mission. He immediately called for another officer to assist him. Both the officers looked around everywhere, but were unable to find any sign of the missing man, and there were no tracks of any kind to follow. After his shift had ended, he was mocked by other officers for wasting his time looking for a man who did not exist. The officer was baffled because he had seen the man as plain as day and then vanished. A short time later, he was approached by a senior officer who told him something that he was unaware of. He said the road that he'd seen the mysterious man on is notorious for paranormal activity, and there were many officers who avoided the road after dark. Apparently, from the 1940s up to the 1960s, the mob used to dump bodies down there because it was the nearest unpopulated area from Detroit, and it was common for them to wrap the body in a rug or blanket. The officer later spoke to a retired officer who told him about an experience that he had once had when he was parked in the same road when he saw a horse-drawn wagon go by, and when he turned onto the road, the wagon had disappeared. But the incident did not happen at night, but in the middle of the day. The officer always believed that ghosts were meant to look blurry and transparent, but the man, it seemed, was clear and could see every detail of him. But that one incident was enough, and he never wanted to experience another one. The police attended many strange incidences in the course of a day, a week, or throughout their career as a police officer. Some of these cases may be minor, comical, sad, or downright traumatic, and can result in them suffering from PTSD, similar to what a soldier may have to endure. But what if they came across an incident there is no explanation, and they enter into the realms of the paranormal? The following story is about a police officer by the name of Alex Garcia, who was with the California Highway Patrol and had an unusual experience one day when pursuing a vehicle. Alex had only recently completed his training period and had been working on his own for a few weeks when the unusual incident occurred. The day was cloudy and on the cool side, and Alex was on the late afternoon shift, which started at 4 p.m. After the usual 30-minute roll call, he then jumped into the patrol car and started his workday as a police officer. As he was driving, he received a call from dispatch, telling him to be on the lookout for a dark blue Nissan pickup that was driving in an erratic manner, but was unable to supply him with the number plate. The Nissan was driving on State Route 1 at speeds of over 85 miles an hour, and the information had been received from another motorist. Alex was just north of the pickup truck and figured he was in a perfect position to spot the dangerous driver, but was then advised by dispatch that the erratic driver was now speeding by an overpass north of where he was now positioned. Alex quickly headed to State 1 and planted his foot to hopefully catch up with the truck. He was regularly updated by dispatch, who told him that the driver was still driving at dangerous speeds, was now overtaking other vehicles using the breakdown lane or shoulder. As Alex drew closer to the Nissan, he was suddenly engulfed by a cloud of dust and debris coming from the emergency lane and quickly stopped his vehicle. After the smoke and dust had cleared, Alex was able to get a better view of the chaos in front of him and found that the Nissan pickup had struck a tree head-on. As he approached the wreck, he could see that the truck had hit the tree so fast that the trunk of the tree was embedded about 5 feet into the engine block. For some strange reason, the airbags had not inflated in the collision, and he could see the driver was slumped unconscious over the steering wheel. He then advised dispatch to send an ambulance and the fire brigade. Alex was in a stressed state, as he had never seen a collision as bad as this one. Whilst waiting for the emergency vehicle to arrive, he then reached through the driver's side window and touched him on the shoulder to see whether there was any signs of life, and what condition the man was in. Alex then screamed out, "Hey, wake up!" But as expected, he got no response. He then screamed out again, "Hey, wake up!" But there was still no response. It was at this stage that another driver arrived at the scene, but they were unable to move or pull the driver to safety. Alex asked the other driver to keep the man's head still to enable him to do CPR. As he got closer to the injured driver, he was able to get a closer look and found that the steering wheel was embedded in the man's chest and his legs had been totally crushed, and there was no doubt in his mind that the man was probably dead, but he continued to assist him. However, each time he attempted to push on the man's chest, it felt like it was pushing into a bowl of soft mush, and as he repeated the move, he could see blood gushing from the man's nose. The ambulance and fire were still on their way, so Alex continued to apply CPR, even though he knew it was a waste of time. When the ambulance finally arrived, it did not take long for them to declare the man deceased. Alex had not been in the force long, and seeing his first dead body gave him an eerie feeling. Eventually, his sergeant arrived at the accident scene and told Alex to direct traffic while he took photos. Alex quickly put on his reflective vest and then set up a cone flare pattern and started to wave people through the terrible scene. As he's directing traffic, some people were doing the right thing and continued on their way, while others held up traffic by rubbernecking to get a closer look at the wrecked truck and flashing lights of the emergency vehicles. It was at this point, while directing traffic, that Alex would have the strangest experience of his life. As he was directing traffic with his left hand, his right hand was balanced on his hip. While he was concentrating hard on directing the traffic, right then and there, someone had taken hold of his right hand. His immediate thought was that another officer wanted to get his attention, but why would they grasp his hand and not grab his shoulder? Alex quickly turned around to see what they wanted, but there was nobody there, and as he looked around, he could see that there was nobody within 30 feet of him. Alex then felt chills crawling up and down his spine and could not rationalize what had just happened to him, and suddenly felt really, really cold. He had never in his life experienced such a weird feeling, and thankfully has never felt it since. Alex was really freaked out as he'd finished directing traffic and was walking back to his patrol car. As he sat in the car, he suddenly felt a sense of relief and was feeling quite calm. He just sat thinking deeply about what had just happened to him and what it was that had grabbed his right hand. He eventually finished his shift, and the following day he kept quiet about what had happened the previous day. Besides, who the hell would believe him? In another strange twist, Alex later found that the driver was a friend of one of his friends and had been a drug addict. Maybe he had grabbed his hand to thank him for helping rescue him and was telling him that he's okay. We all love a scary story and like to be creeped out, but in the end, we feel confident in the fact that it was just a story, that it was not true. The following are two terrifying stories told by police officers that were actually true. Story number 2. One evening a few years ago, 2 police officers were sent out on a rainy night to a call from an elderly woman. She called to say that she kept hearing footsteps in her house and believed there was a ghost inside because she regularly heard the sounds of someone walking upstairs and that she lived alone. They decided to check it out and to make sure that everything was okay. The lady wished to stay on the line with 911 because she was terrified. About 3 minutes after she initially called in, she said that there was actually a man standing outside her backyard, staring at her through a sliding glass door. Petrified, the woman froze and just stared at the man. For the next minute or two, she said that he was just standing there, still as could be, staring at her, and then slowly walked away. When the officers arrived about 12 minutes after the call first came in, they went to the front door. One officer remained with the woman, while the other officer went to the backyard to see if the man was still hiding out or if there were any traces of him. The officer spoke with her for several minutes until the other officer returned. He said that there was no trace of anyone having been in the backyard. They then set off to do a quick sweep of the property to ensure the house was all clear. The officers then came to the realization that although the woman had definitely seen a man's reflection, she mistakenly thought it was in front of her, on the other side of the glass, in her backyard. In reality, he'd been standing close to her, in the same room, while she'd been talking to 911. Nothing was stolen or broken, or appeared to be out of place, so they don't know what his intentions were. However, they feared what could have happened to her had she not stayed on the line with the operator and they had not arrived so quickly. Story number 1. One night the following police officer was off duty and was driving to a friend's house when he observed a vehicle parked alone in the middle of a church parking lot. He figured the car was driven by young people just hanging around as they do, but still decided to check things out. He pulled up to the side of the vehicle and could see that no one was inside. He then positioned the car behind it to check the number plate. He figured it could have been stolen and dumped in the parking lot. As he was riding down the plate, he looked at the car through the back window and saw there was a person in the front seat looking at him through the rearview mirror. This is something you notice as a cop because when you do traffic stops you can tell how intently someone was really watching you inside your car and possibly if they're going to try something. But then his flesh started to crawl because only minutes before he had thoroughly checked to see if there were people inside the car and it was definitely empty. So to reassure himself that he was not imagining things, he again slowly drove alongside the vehicle, looked inside the car, and there was absolutely nobody there. The next day he returned to the parking lot and the car was gone. He has no idea what he'd seen, but was sure somebody was in the car, as he could clearly see their eyes looking back at him. When on duty, he and his partner used to sit outside the church on quiet nights because it was tucked away and you could relax. He no longer parks there.